In 2026, 5 notorious criminals are set to face their final moments. But their cases aren't just about the crimes they committed. They've become battlegrounds for the future of capital punishment in America. From chilling murders to controversial legal battles, the execution methods themselves are sparking fierce debates. Who are these prisoners, and what dark legacies have they left behind? You won't want to miss the shocking details. Before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest true crime content. Stay tuned to learn more about these chilling cases and drop your thoughts in the comments below. David Lee Roberts, Alabama. In the year 1992, a quiet town in Alabama became the site of a heinous act that would reverberate through the community for decades. David Lee Roberts, a man with a past already marred by violence, committed an act so brutal that it shocked even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. His victim, Anetra Jones, was a young woman with a promising future, a life tragically cut short by a man whose heart seemed as cold as the fire he would soon set. The crime was both chilling and methodical. On the evening of her murder, Anetra was shot at point-blank range, a violent end to a life filled with potential. But the horror didn't end there. In an attempt to erase all traces of his crime, Roberts set her house ablaze, watching as the flames consumed the evidence, the innocent memories, and the truth that could have brought justice sooner. The fire, an inferno of destruction, would burn not only the walls of her home, but also the trust the community once had in its safety. Roberts, in his cold and calculated effort to cover his tracks, ensured that the fire would leave no clues behind. But it wasn't the flames that ultimately uncovered the truth. It was the tireless work of investigators who refused to let this crime be forgotten. Forensic evidence eventually led to his conviction, and the loss of Anetra Jones would not fade into the ashes of that night. Now, as the years have passed and justice takes its course, Roberts is set to meet his end on August 21st, 2026. But the method of his execution will not be one of the more traditional means. Instead, Alabama has chosen a method still unfamiliar to most, a controversial and untested technique known as nitrogen hypoxia. Imagine, if you will, a world where the very air we breathe becomes our undoing. In this method, the oxygen that sustains life is replaced with nitrogen, a gas that renders the body unconscious and ultimately lifeless. It is a method that is still in its experimental stages, one that has sparked fierce debates about its humanity and effectiveness. Some argue that it may offer a more humane alternative to lethal injection, while others believe it introduces more uncertainty into a system already fraught with flaws. The use of nitrogen hypoxia for Roberts' execution will mark Alabama's 6th attempt with this unproven method, a fact that underscores the growing tensions surrounding the ethical considerations of capital punishment. This new approach, both scientifically and morally uncharted, will continue to stir questions. Is it more humane, or merely a veiled step into the unknown? Roberts' execution will not simply be a moment of closure for the crime he committed, but also a defining moment in the ongoing evolution of the death penalty in America. The use of nitrogen hypoxia marks an experiment on the highest level, a test of a method that, like the flames of Anetra's house, could either cleanse or further darken the fabric of justice. Will it be an advancement in how society deals with the ultimate punishment, or will it become yet another chapter in a troubled history of trial and error in death row procedures? As the date approaches, the eyes of the nation will be on Alabama, watching as this uncharted execution method is carried out. But while the focus will be on the means of death, it is crucial not to lose sight of the story that led to this moment, the life of Anetra Jones, stolen far too soon, and the lingering questions surrounding justice, punishment, and the very cost of life itself. Harold Nichols. Tennessee Harold Nichols, a man whose life had already been touched by violence, committed a horrific act that left a young woman's life extinguished in an instant. Karen Pulley, a 24-year-old woman full of promise and potential, became Nichols' victim. The crime was not a random act of violence, but one of deliberate cruelty. Nichols, in cold calculation, raped Karen before shooting her and leaving her body in a remote location and far from the gaze of society. The finality of her death, the cruelty in the act, and the depravity of his actions painted a portrait of a man capable of unfathomable violence. What struck many beyond the gruesome details of the crime itself was the coldness which Nichols executed his plan. The brutal nature of his attack raised uncomfortable questions. What drives a person to commit such a violent, premeditated act? What does it say about a man's capacity for evil when every step of the crime is carried out with such chilling deliberation? As law enforcement unraveled the crime, the evidence pointed unmistakably to Nichols. He was convicted of the rape and murder of Karen Pulley, and her tragic death became a symbol of the horrific nature of premeditated violence, a crime that could not be excused by the spur of the moment, but was rooted in calculated malice. As the years passed, Nichols's fate was sealed with a conviction that would ultimately lead him to Tennessee's death row. And yet the method by which he will meet his end remains the subject of intense debate. Set for execution on December 11, 2026, Nichols faces a choice that could alter the course of his execution: lethal injection or electrocution. Lethal injection, the method most commonly used in the United States, has become synonymous with modern executions. However, in Tennessee, electrocution remains a viable option, one that has raised significant ethical and constitutional concerns. The state's debate over whether to use the electric chair or the more modern, seemingly more humane method of lethal injection adds another layer of complexity to Nichols's case. For many, electrocution evokes an image of barbarity, an outdated method that risks prolonging suffering and poses questions about its legitimacy in a modern justice system. While lethal injection is the default method, electrocution remains an option if the prisoner so chooses, or if lethal injection is unavailable. Nichols' case has highlighted the growing controversy over execution methods, drawing attention to the ethical challenges and the human cost of carrying out such punishments. What makes Nichols' case particularly contentious is not only the crime he committed, but the method of his execution. The debate over electrocution's morality has been heated in Tennessee, where numerous discussions have centered on whether it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, violating constitutional rights. While some argue that electrocution is a fitting end for a man who committed such unspeakable acts, others assert that it is a throwback to a bygone era, a method that should be left in the past. This ongoing discussion adds another layer of uncertainty and anguish to Nichols' final days. The decision on how his execution will be carried out is more than a matter of procedure. It is a reflection of the state's shifting stance on the death penalty, its methods, and its moral responsibilities. As the execution date approaches, the eyes of the nation will watch closely, not only for the outcome of Nichols' case, but for the larger implications it carries for the future of capital punishment in America. Gerald Robert Hand, Ohio. Gerald Robert Hand's life has been one marked by an unsettling series of events, but none more chilling than the murder of his fourth wife, which would ultimately reveal a disturbing pattern of fatal outcomes surrounding his previous marriages. In 2026, Hand's execution will mark the final chapter of a crime that shocked not only the state of Ohio, but also the nation. In 2004, Hand orchestrated the murder of his fourth wife, a crime so meticulously planned that it bore the hallmarks of a man who had not only prepared for, but seemingly anticipated his victim's demise. With the help of a hitman, Hand set into motion a series of events that would end his wife's life in cold blood. What made this crime especially horrifying wasn't just the methodical nature of the murder. It was the realization that Hand had been involved in similar, equally suspicious deaths in the past. Throughout his previous marriages, Hand had experienced the untimely deaths of 3 wives, each one with a set of circumstances that raised suspicions but never resulted in convictions. His fourth wife's murder, however, was different. Investigators, after reviewing the pattern, began to see a chilling and consistent thread running through the deaths. His reputation grew darker, and the media began calling him the Black Widower, a name that would forever tie him to a string of lethal fates. In the years following the murder, Hand's calculated orchestration of his wife's death became the focus of a nationwide investigation. Prosecutors were relentless in their pursuit of justice, and after years of legal battles, Gerald Robert Hand was convicted of his fourth wife's murder. The case became infamous not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the terrifying possibility that Hand had been allowed to escape justice for so long. On June 17, 2026, Hand is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection, a method that has become the most common form of capital punishment in the United States. For many, the choice of lethal injection as the execution method offers a more humane alternative compared to older methods, such as the electric chair or the gas chamber. But for others, it remains a necessary and sobering reminder of the consequences of one man's violence. In Hand's case, the manner of his execution may bring some sense of closure to the victims' families, though it can never truly erase the horror of his actions. Lethal injection, despite its seemingly sterile and clinical nature, carries with it weight of justice, a final, irreversible step for a man whose crimes spanned years and left a trail of pain and death in his wake. What sets Gerald Robert Hand's case apart from other high-profile death penalty cases is the eerie and chilling nature of his crimes, combined with his well-earned moniker as the Black Widower. The suspicion that Hand may have been responsible for the deaths of 3 previous wives before finally being caught has turned his case into a haunting symbol of the dangers of unchecked violence and the failure of the justice system to intervene sooner. Hand's execution represents not only the end of his life, but also the closing of a dark chapter in Ohio's criminal history. It is a case that has captivated the nation, drawing attention to the chilling pattern of fatal outcomes surrounding his marriages and sparking conversations about the complexities of justice, punishment, and the lengths to which a person will go to protect their own interests, no matter the cost. Danny Lee Hill, Ohio. In 1985, a crime occurred in Ohio that would forever haunt the state's history, a crime so unspeakably horrific that it would be etched into the collective memory of a nation. Danny Lee Hill, then just 18 years old, was convicted for the brutal murder of 12-year-old Raymond Fife, a case that remains one of the most disturbing child murders in Ohio's history. Raymond was abducted from his neighborhood, subjected to unspeakable horrors, and ultimately murdered in a way that no child should ever have to endure. Hill's actions were nothing short of monstrous. He brutally attacked Raymond, leaving the young boy to die in a remote area where he was discovered later that day. The cruelty involved in the murder shocked the community to its core, and the details of the case left people reeling, unable to comprehend how such a violent act could have been inflicted upon an innocent child. Hill's conviction was swift, and he was sentenced to death. The crime, coupled with the details of Raymond's suffering, became a symbol of the darkest side of humanity. It sparked outrage, grief, and a sense of collective mourning for a life so violently taken. The case became infamous not just because of the murder itself, but because of the chilling nature of the crime and the deep emotional impact it had on Ohio's citizens. On July 22, 2026, Danny Lee Hill is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection, a method that has been the primary form of capital punishment in Ohio and across the United States in recent years. The process, typically seen as more humane than older methods like electrocution or the gas chamber, is nonetheless a somber and irreversible end to a life. For many, Hill's execution is seen as the final act of justice for a child whose life was stolen in the most brutal way. But for others, the use of lethal injection raises deep questions, especially in Hill's case, where his mental capacity has been a source of immense controversy. While the legal system has determined Hill's execution to be justified, the broader public remains divided over whether this method is the right one for a man whose mental state and his eligibility for capital punishment have been hotly debated for decades. What makes Danny Lee Hill's case so uniquely controversial is not just the brutality of the crime, but the intense legal and ethical debates surrounding his mental capacity. Hill's defense has long argued that he is intellectually disabled, a claim that has been supported by some psychological evaluations, but disputed by others. The question of whether he should be executed, given his mental limitations, has sparked national outcry. Legal experts, human rights activists, and those in the public eye have all raised concerns about whether it is ethical or just to execute someone whose cognitive abilities may have rendered them incapable of fully understanding the consequences of their actions. This debate reached its zenith in the years leading up to Hill's scheduled execution, with numerous court hearings and appeals aimed at halting his death sentence. Hill's case became a flashpoint for larger discussions on the ethical implications of executing people with intellectual disabilities, raising fundamental questions about the nature of justice and the limits of punishment. The Supreme Court of the United States has ruled against executing individuals with intellectual disabilities, but the application of this rule has been inconsistent, leading to confusion and controversy in cases like Hill's. As Hill's execution date draws near, the questions surrounding his mental health will remain at the forefront of public discussion. Can justice be served if the person facing the death penalty cannot fully comprehend the weight of their crime? Is executing someone with intellectual disabilities a form of justice, or is it a cruel violation of basic human rights? Blaine Milm, Texas. In 2008, a crime unfolded in the state of Texas that would send shockwaves through the nation, not only because of the unimaginable brutality involved, but because of the twisted motives behind it. Blaine Milm, a man with a troubled past, was convicted for the horrific death of his girlfriend's 13-month-old daughter, Amora Carson. But what makes this case particularly chilling is the sickening and bizarre rationale behind the murder, the act of a failed exorcism. Milm, along with his girlfriend, believed that the child was possessed by demons, a belief that led them down a dark, depraved path. In an attempt to drive out the demon, Milm subjected the helpless child to brutal physical violence. He beat Amora mercilessly, leaving her with horrific injuries that would ultimately lead to her death. The details of her suffering were so horrifying that they made national headlines, each report more difficult to comprehend than the last. Amora's death was not a result of a momentary act of rage. It was the culmination of a sustained period of torment inflicted on a defenseless child under the guise of a religious ritual. The belief that a child was possessed, used as a justification for unspeakable violence, became the central focus of this case, leaving many to question how such a tragedy could happen. The case sparked outrage and disgust, as the very notion of an exorcism being used as an excuse for abuse seemed incomprehensible to most. Blaine Milm was convicted for the murder, and the public was left grappling with the chilling details of how such violence could be rationalized through superstition and delusion. This crime, one of the most horrifying of its kind, left Amora's family devastated and the community reeling from the shock of a life so cruelly taken. Milm's scheduled execution is set for September 25, 2026, and it will be carried out by lethal injection, Texas' preferred method of execution. Lethal injection, while widely considered a more humane alternative to methods like electrocution or the gas chamber, still carries the weight of finality and irreversibility. Milm, as a convicted child murderer, will face this form of capital punishment in the final chapter of a case that has remained at the forefront of public debate for years. However, the legal process surrounding Milm's execution has been anything but straightforward. The case has seen multiple delays, largely due to ongoing concerns about the forensic evidence and the mental state of the defendant at the time of the crime. Milm's defense has argued that he was not mentally competent when the crime occurred, raising doubts about whether he fully understood the gravity of his actions. These legal battles have kept his execution on hold, creating a cloud of uncertainty about whether justice will ever truly be served for Amora. What makes Blaine Milm's case particularly significant is the ongoing legal debate surrounding his mental state and the validity of the forensic evidence presented at trial. The delays in his execution highlight the complex nature of capital punishment cases, particularly when questions arise about the defendant's mental health and whether the evidence used to convict them is sound. Milm's execution, if it proceeds as planned, will likely be one of the most heavily scrutinized in recent years. Legal experts, human rights activists, and those in the public eye have all raised concerns about the fairness of executing someone whose mental state may have been compromised at the time of the crime. Milum's case has sparked broader discussions about the intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the death penalty, with many questioning whether it is just to carry out an execution under such circumstances. As the year 2026 approaches, these 5 executions stand as grim reminders of the complex intersection between crime, punishment, and the law. Each case is more than just a death sentence. It's a symbol of a broken system, an unhealed wound in our society, and a contentious battle over justice and morality. The final moments of these prisoners will likely echo long after the executions take place, forcing us to question everything we think we know about capital punishment. If you found these stories unsettling, make sure you're subscribed so you can stay informed about all the latest true crime cases. Hit the like button if you think the death penalty is an issue that needs more discussion. Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. And as always, thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more jaw-dropping stories.